In this video, we're going to be talking about Robert Nozick and an excerpt from his book, Anarchy, State, and Utopia. So we're going to be continuing our discussion of distributive justice, and this time around, we're going to be talking in a roundabout way a little bit about basketball. So here's the plan for today. We're going to learn about what Nozick calls the entitlement theory. And in order to understand Nozick's argument for small government and the view that equality of distribution is not what we want to aim for in a just system of property holdings, we're going to need to get a clear look at historical versus end result principles. And Nozick will introduce the notion of a patterned theory of distributive justice, but then he's going to critique that kind of theory by looking at what is famously known as the Wilt-Chamberlain argument against wealth redistribution. Towards the end of the video, we will also look at some of Nozick's criticisms of Locke's theory of property, but we will also see that there are parts of Locke that Nozick will also agree with. So we will also find some connections between what we're reading today and things that we've already seen in the course. So it's going to be a whirlwind tour. Let's buckle in. Let's get to work. So in this book that Nozick released in 1974, Anarchy, State, and Utopia, he writes this. So he says that the minimal state is the most extensive state that can be justified. He says that any state larger than this so-called minimal state is going to be a violation of people's rights. What is he talking about when he talks about the minimal state? Well, he's talking about the least extensive or obtrusive version of government. So to put it in other terminology, we're going to try to maximize negative liberty, right? But the sense in which we want to maximize negative liberty, he does recognize that you do lose some freedom if everybody has the right to do everything. So we will need like a police state that's going to protect certain values, the kind of values that Locke had in mind earlier in the course, things like life, liberty, and property. What are we going to need in order to protect those values? Well, we figure that out, and then we don't use the state for anything more. So we don't use the state for promoting equality. We certainly don't use the state for what Nozick might see as like frivolous functions, like promoting the arts. In the selection from Anarchy, State, and Utopia that we're going to be looking at, we're going to be looking at one hypothesis that speaks against the minimal state, this goal of distributive justice. The idea that part of why the government should exist might be because we want to get more equality into society, and it's the job of the government to notice where wealth is unequal and then redistribute wealth to make it more equal. Nozick will even say that arguing about distributive justice, to talk about the right distribution, is loaded as terminology right from the outset. The point of distributive justice even suggests that maybe somebody should be out there distributing. He says that, the holdings, the property that people own in society isn't like some cake that's been divvied up by parents and now they're making some corrections to the cuts. He says, no, it's not like that. Instead, he says that, what people own is a matter of natural voluntary transactions, and there is no central distributor. So Nozick would like to talk about, instead of distributive justice, justice in terms of people's holdings, even though the general terminology of distributive justice is commonly known to be the philosophical theory of who is entitled to what, specifically goods. All right, so Nozick is going to lay out his theory of the principles that we should use to determine what is just in terms of holdings. He's going to give us a few principles, and after that, we're going to look at the competitor theories. So here's Nozick's line of thought. He's going to say justice in acquisition. So the first line of thought here is that there is a situation where there are things that are owned by nobody that come to be owned by someone in particular. So we saw a theory of justice in acquisition from Locke, where he argued that when you mix your labor with some unowned goods from the commons, they go from being nobody's property to your property. That would be justice in acquisition. Now, we will see eventually that Nozick will find problems with Locke's labor mixing theory, but he will grant that somehow, some way, we could work out a theory of how unowned things come to be owned things. Maybe he could use something like Hume's theory, a convention of justice that creates the original property right of ownership. 2, he's going to say that we could have justice in transfer. Here's a simple thought. You own some goods. Let's say you have a $20 bill in your wallet, and you know that your nephew's birthday is coming up, and you decide that the right thing to do for your nephew's birthday is to take that $20 bill, put it inside of a card, and give it to your nephew. That is a situation of a gift, right? And in that situation, you have voluntarily transferred the property rights in that $20 bill to your nephew. So now you're $20 poorer and your nephew is $20 richer. We can have other instances of justice and transfer, whether it is trading goods or whether it's trading money for services or money for other goods, right? But the idea is that we can have justice in who owns what, partly through an explanation of who and how it is transferred to. Who it is transferred to and how. He says, in a perfect world, this is all we would need, right? If people just always justly acquired things from nature or from the stock of unowned goods, and then all the goods were transferred justly and voluntarily, that could be a complete explanation of all the property holdings in a perfectly just society. Nozick says that we might also need a principle of rectification of injustice in holdings. So there's a question here of, well, what happens when one person is holding some good, let's say a car, but that car, it turns out, is a stolen car? Well, Nozick says that in this less than perfect world, justice would require that the stolen car be brought back to its rightful owner. So I guess the person who probably acquired that car rightfully through the proper method of transfer. So here's how we figure out these 3 principles, what each person is entitled to. And then if we just get everybody the holdings that they are entitled to, that would be a just distribution for Nozick. And he's going to say that in this situation, we could have state 1 and state 2. State 1 where you have a certain amount of money, state 2 where you have less money, but your nephew has $20 more. Those can both be just because we were playing within the rules of just acquisitions and transfers. He gives us the analogy that the moves, according to these principles, can be justice preserving. That is, we can be in a state where the holdings are just, and we can change the holdings, but justice will remain because we were following these basic principles of rightly acquiring things, rightly transferring things, and in cases where things have gone wrong, we rectify. And he says that, logic can be truth-preserving. So if I make an argument like if P, then Q, and then I argue P, therefore Q. What logicians will point out is that if you give me a statement, if P then Q, if there's a dog in the room, then there's a mammal in the room, and you put in another true proposition, I guess there's a dog in the room, that is going to justify Q, there's a mammal in the room. And his thought is that just like a logically valid argument like this one, if P then Q, P therefore Q, that is truth preserving, because every time you put in true premises, you'll get a true conclusion. He says that following the principles of transfer and acquisition will be justice preserving. If you have a just situation and then you follow those three rules, the new situation that you come to will also be just. Now, we can start to think about how Nozick's entitlement theory and justice in acquisitions and transfers can stack up against other theories, and how can we contrast it with other theories? Now, what Nozick wants you to notice is that his theory of justice in holdings is a historical theory. Whether a particular distribution is just, so think about all the things that you own and all the assets that you have, and think about all the things that somebody else owns and all the assets that they have. He says that it might be the case that this set of assets is just rather than unjust, right? But let's say that you came into a situation where everybody has the exact same stuff and the exact same financial assets, but in this situation, even though the numbers are the same, in the second situation, all of your money you got through bank robbery rather than doing your job and being voluntarily paid. Well, it's the same distribution of goods, but in history A, you got it through work, and through history B, you got it through theft. And the thought would be that how a distribution comes about matters. And this is the way in which Nozick thinks that his approach is a historical theory. Right? So what happened before is going to be a big determining factor about which distributions are actually just. Now, Nozick will then point out, imagine somebody else who says that when we're figuring out what a just distribution of goods is, they might take the approach as a utilitarian, right? Now, the utilitarian will say, do the thing in terms of goods and holdings that's going to lead to the greatest amount of overall happiness over suffering, right? And we might say that in that case, what happened in the past doesn't really matter so much as what the distribution is doing right now in the present, and maybe what the distribution will do to happiness in the long run. So in that way, it doesn't care at all about what happened in the past or who is entitled to or who deserves what, as Nozick might say. If you're an egalitarian, if you're just trying to make everybody equal in what they have and what they own, we would only, again, need to focus on what the present situation is. Does this person, A, have an equal amount of goods as B? He says, in that situation, you only have to look at the present. You don't have to look at any questions about who earned what, who acquired things in the first place, or what the voluntary agreements and transfers were. You just have to look at the present. And Nozick will say that when we look at unhistorical principles of distributive justice, we can think of those as end result principles or end state principles. Because, remember, if you're a utilitarian about distributive justice, you're just focusing on where you wind up with the most possible happiness. Or if you're all about equality, then you're just going to be focusing on that end result or end state. Rather than the history, you're going to focus on the end state of getting people to an equal amount of goods or wealth for each. Now, Nozick also suggests that we can think of patterned theories of distributive justice. Right? Now, a patterned theory of justice could be a historical principle. Right? So a patterned theory might say, look back and say, well, we should give the amount of wealth and goods to a person that correlates with how well they've done in this life. Right? So he says that, somebody's moral merit, whether they've been a good person, should make a difference to what burdens and benefits they encounter. And he says that you could put in a bunch of other different possible factors. So we could also have a historical theory that looks at how much effort that you've put in and how hard you've worked through your life. So Nozick is going to say, let us call a principle of distribution patterned if it specifies that a distribution, that is, who has what, is to vary along with some natural dimension, weighted sum of natural dimensions, or lexicographic ordering of natural dimensions. So when we're talking about a weighted sum, that might be give 20% consideration to how much moral merit, give 20% consideration to effort, give 20% consideration to, your IQ or whatever, right? And a lexicographic ordering might say, well, first we're going to look at this, and then after that we're going to bring in other factors. But the main point to notice here is that we're going to vary distributions, so, what goods you have and how much money you have in your pocket, along with a natural dimension. Don't get too hung up on what Nozick means by the word natural. In the text, he points out that what he really wants to avoid is made-up dimensions or arbitrary dimensions, right? But we might say like moral merit would count as one natural dimension. What Nozick is really looking for when he's talking about natural dimensions is just factual features of an individual that we can use to determine what goods they deserve. And to use those factual features to determine what they ought to own, that's patterned, right? The pattern that Nozick is seeing here is he's trying to have a correlation between, say, a natural dimension, like how good you are or how much effort you've put in, and have that be directly correlated with what goods and distributions you are entitled to. So different things could be the pattern. And again, we could also bring in things like usefulness to society or IQ. And Nozick is going to point out here, right, his entitlement theory, the theory that focuses on justness in acquisitions, justness in transfers, and rectification of unjust holdings. He's going to say, those aren't looking at facts about how much effort or decency you've put in, or where the effort or usefulness to society lies, right? Instead, Nozick seems to be focused more on what people voluntarily consent to in terms of transfers. Now, here, Nozick is going to focus on the idea that there are going to be problems even with a pattern theory, much like we would find problems with enforcing perfect equality. And this is where we come in with what Nozick calls, or what is called by philosophers who talk about Nozick, the Wilt-Chamberlain argument. So Nozick is giving us a thought experiment here in order to point out a problem with a patterned approach to justice and holdings. It also seems to me to be a problem for any end-state theory, like a theory of perfect equality. So pick your favorite patterned theory of distributive justice. And for now, let's just assume that this patterned theory is true, right? So just think about a theory that looks at how much effort people put in society, right? And imagine that the distributions are accordingly realized. So we're living in this special kind of perfect world where people who do equal effort are going to have the same amount of access to goods and resources and money, right? So we then realize all those distributions. And we're going to call this situation D1 for distribution 1. Now, imagine in this society, Wilt Chamberlain, famous basketball player from the 70s here, Chamberlain makes a deal with his team. Now, the deal seems kind of quaint, now that we're 51 years on. But imagine that every basketball fan who comes to see Chamberlain play for, let's say in this situation, the Lakers, is going to give Chamberlain an extra 25 cents for every home ticket sold. Right? Now, in this situation, the fans, they love to watch Wilt Chamberlain play basketball. Right? So they come with their hard-earned money, and when they get their ticket ripped, they are also dropping a quarter, 25 cents, into a box, and that money is designed to go directly to Wilt Chamberlain. So he earns $250,000 throughout the season because the Lakers, throughout the 50 games or whatever that they play throughout the season in the playoffs that year, they sell exactly 1 million tickets. So 1 million quarters works out to $250,000, and this bucket of quarters is then transferred to Chamberlain at the end of the season. So we're in a perfectly just world, and then all of a sudden, Chamberlain becomes $250,000 richer. And in this new situation, we'll call this situation D2, we've got everybody else 25 cents poorer, or maybe some people bought more than one ticket throughout the course of the season, but everybody who went and saw the basketball games throughout the season has lost some additional money due to paying to watch Wilt. And Chamberlain is now $250,000 richer. Now, here's Nozick's point. He says, if D1 was a just distribution, and people voluntarily moved it to D2, that is, they transferred parts of their wealth and assets that they had in a perfectly just society, right? And he points out, what is your money for if not to spend it on things, right? He's going to say, isn't it the case that D2 is also just? So I'll leave you to reflect on that for a moment, right? That it seems that everybody here, the basketball team owners, Wilt, the fans, are going to consent to this new situation. But here's the problem that Nozick is noticing. The distribution of wealth that we find in this situation where distributions of wealth are being moved around on the basis of voluntary choice, we now have everybody in the society becoming a little bit poorer, and we have Wilt a bit richer, right? But that means that our distribution has moved away from D1, which the pattern theory is going to say is a perfectly just situation. The pattern theory, it seems, Nozick is thinking, once we get to D2, has moved us into an unjust situation. But if Nozick is right, it was justly transferred, so it is just. So the point that Nozick is making here is that the patterned approach to distributive justice is going to give us the wrong result in these cases of voluntary transfers of goods, services, and wealth. So the argument against pattern theories. Here's what Nozick says. He says the point, illustrated by the Wilt Chamberlain example and the example of the entrepreneur in a socialist society, right? In some socialist societies, everybody would be given the exact same amount of wealth, but then maybe some of them would take the time and effort and initiative to make counterfeit blue jeans that couldn't be bought in Soviet Russia. Well, that changes the distributions, and now the entrepreneur in socialist society has more wealth. So, Nozick points out, no principle of perfect equality or utilitarianism could keep the right amount of wealth preserved. And moreover, a patterned theory that's supposed to correlate holdings with something like effort or moral merit, we could possibly realize these distributions, but he says that if we tried to continuously realize these distributions, we would have to continuously interfere with people's lives, and we would prevent the voluntary transfers of wealth and goods that we see as like the function and main reason why we have money in the first place. So the argument here seems to be you can't do a theory of equality, and you also can't do a theory of patterning without giving the wrong result in a case like Wilt Chamberlain, where people are making voluntary transfers. So I'll leave it to you to reflect on whether by ruling out end-state principles and pattern principles of distribution, if he's ruled out the possibility of any justification for a welfare state. And next time around, we're going to be looking at John Rawls. And there, too, we might see an opportunity to justify something more comprehensive than Nozick's minimal state. So in this way, watch for that, right? And think about whether Nozick has given us a good reason to be skeptical of any project of distributive justice. Let's just recap the argument quickly. We'll modernize it slightly. This will be the LeBron James version of the argument. Assume society at T1 has a just distribution of holdings. Pick your favorite pattern theory again. And now we have LeBron James being voluntarily paid. And now we're not talking about a quaint little $250,000 anymore. Now for LeBron to play for the Lakers, I looked this up yesterday, he's making $48.73 million a year at the time of this recording. And we would think that, look, he becomes $48 million richer in the course of a basketball season. And it means that if the original amount of money that he had at the start of the season is just, then it will also be just when he's voluntarily given more money by consenting parties. So, in this way, LeBron's distribution of wealth is changing. And if it's possible for the prior holdings at T1 to be just, as well as his holdings at T2 to be just, then patterned principles of justice, and certainly theories of equality as the principle of justice, are going to be false. So, these patterned principles of justice are false, and it does seem that a big point in Nozick's argument is that pattern distributions can only emerge and be sustained through massive interference. We might think of this as violations of our natural rights to do what we see fit with our money and our property. Now, this point about having a right to our property might make you think that, oh, so Nozick is just a really big John Locke fan. Remember that John Locke told us that you have a natural right to property because you have a natural right to yourself, and your labor, and thereby the things that you mix your labor with, are an extension of you. Well, Nozick will actually point out that he's not very impressed with Locke's theory of labor mixing as a theory of how we acquire property. Now, I will advise my students forever to not make arguments through the use of rhetorical questions. But for better or for worse, Nozick does just that. In his objections to Locke, he says, for instance, why is mixing what I own with what I don't own a way of losing what I own rather than gaining what I don't? Right? He says, I own a can of tomato juice and I spill it in the ocean. Let's say that we have some way of seeing where all the particles of the tomato juice went. Nozick then points out, do I thereby come to own the whole sea by distributing my tomato juice throughout it? Or have I just foolishly dissipated my tomato juice? Now, that's the rhetorical question. It seems that the answer that Nozick is suggesting is that the foolish dissipation interpretation of the situation is as plausible or more plausible than the acquisition hypothesis. Nozick also notes that there are problems with the idea that value is added through difficulty of labor, because we might produce very valuable things very easily and very happily, and that doesn't lessen their value necessarily. And he also points out that even though labor can improve things or take effort, well, just because you've improved a thing or put work into it, there are cases where putting a lot of effort into something doesn't make it better, right? So he gives the example of spray painting a piece of driftwood. It was much prettier before you put a bunch of pink enamel spray paint on it. And in this way, he's going to say that we can't assume that value is added every time we mix our labor with something. Now, basically what Nozick is saying here, and this is a strange thing to admit, although it's a philosophically honest thing to admit, he says that he doesn't have a fully worked out theory of how acquisition can work. Locke's theory is the leading theory, the labor mixing theory, that is. It's the leading theory of how we acquire property in the first place, how things not owned by anybody become owned by someone. He thinks that the labor mixing theory has all these flaws, that the theory can't answer his rhetorical questions, yet he's confident enough that there's some way in which we can explain how property acquisition works. Now, even though he disagrees with Locke on the labor mixing theory of acquisition, he does agree with Locke's proviso that when you acquire property and you acquire goods, you must leave, as Locke suggested, enough and as good left in common for others. Remember, the thought would be, if my drinking a cup of water from the stream still leaves enough water for you to drink from the stream as well, I haven't done anything offensive to you, and I haven't lessened your opportunities at all. Now, if I go to a tree and picked the last 3 pieces of fruit off of it, that would leave you with no fruit, rather than if I only took 1 piece. And in this way, Nozick is going to suggest that this Lockean proviso does seem to have a point, that there are limits on what we can acquire. So he thinks that it would be a bad thing, that people can be unfairly treated if one person overaccumulates, and then they would have a monopoly on a certain good, and that could lead to exploitation and manipulation of others. And he also points out that this theory of leaving enough as good left in common for others, that might explain why we have things like intellectual property, but also expiration of patents. At some point, if a patent is left on a product for too long, it actually makes innovation harder throughout the rest of society, even though we do see the value of protecting a patent for some time so that a person can benefit from the contributions that they've made to the world of intellectual matters or inventions. Now, here's the last point. in our reading, we get mainly an assertion here. We don't have an argument in the book. But Nozick will point out to us that he believes that the free operation of a market system, so basic capitalism, where people acquire money, sell their labor, where they can become richer or poorer on the basis of voluntary choices, that's going to still leave enough and as good left in common for others. And in this way, he's going to say that there is nothing offensive in basic market capitalism that leaves some unable to fend for themselves under the same system. So when we look at Locke, we see problems that Nozick has with Locke, but also deference and respect for some of the other approaches that Locke gives us, but in a way that suggests that Nozick doesn't see any problems for basic free market capitalism within these Lockean parameters. So just to sum up some of the things that we've seen in this reading, Nozick is going to suggest that distributive justice is not sufficient to show that something larger than the minimal state is justified. If we want to figure out who should own what, we should think about a principle of acquisition, which he doesn't have fully worked out, but transfer and rectification will also be the sorts of things that we actually want to be looking for when we figure out whether certain situations of holdings are just or not. Nozick favors historical principles over end result. So in this way, we need to focus not just on how much each person has or how close to equality we are, but we should focus on the history of who agreed to what and when. He favors this entitlement theory, following these three principles over a pattern distribution, which says that goods and other valuable things, money, should be distributed simply according to effort, because his Wilt Chamberlain thought experiment shows that liberty and freedom to expend, transfer, trade your goods is more important than making sure that everybody has goods and wealth that perfectly correlate with something like effort. And then the last thing that we saw, even though he's got problems with Locke's theory of acquisition, he does agree with Locke's proviso that we should leave enough and as good for others. But even though he puts up that limit on what we can acquire and when, he doesn't think that basic free market capitalism runs afoul of that proviso. So those are the main points I want to get across about Nozick's theory of distributive justice, or as he would prefer to call it, justice in holdings. Next time, we'll look at one of the competing theories. So instead of looking at an argument for a minimal state, we're going to look at an argument that basically justifies the modern welfare state in another classic from the 1970s, A Theory of Justice by John Rawls. So that's where we'll pick up the conversation next time. Thanks for listening in, and take care.